Jace Morgan had never been one for crowds, politics, or even much interaction with people beyond his small circle. He was a farmer. He loved the land, the smell of fresh earth, and the endless fields that stretched out in every direction. It was a life he had chosen, free from the complications of the city and the chaos of the outside world. But the universe had other plans. The first time the Crialians arrived, he thought they were a hoax. The world's leaders had spent weeks preparing for the inevitable, and when the day finally came, the ship wasn't what anyone expected. It didn't land in the heart of New York or Washington, or even in the center of Paris. It came straight to the quiet, rolling hills of his farm. Jace had never been particularly involved with the global stage. So when the government asked for a neutral zone to facilitate an unprecedented meeting with an alien species, they found him. A man with no political connections, no grand purpose, and absolutely no desire to entertain extraterrestrial diplomacy. It was supposed to be just a temporary arrangement, but days turned into weeks, weeks into months. And now, Jace's farm had become a sort of sanctuary for alien ambassadors. Specifically, the Crialians, a massive insectoid species that had a curious interest in Earth's natural resources. They didn't come for conquest, but for a strange kind of collaboration. They needed something humans had: agriculture. In exchange, the Crialians brought advanced technology, medical knowledge, and military prowess, though Jace wasn't too sure how the whole military aspect fit into the picture. The humans had their reservations, but for some reason, Jace had been thrust into the role of liaison, and it seemed to be working out. Sort of. And then there was Oleran. Oleran, the Crialian queen, had a daughter. She was a princess, of course. And unlike her mother, who was all business, her daughter, Arixa, was wild, rebellious, intrigued by humans, fascinated by Jace's way of life. She would wander through the fields, ask endless questions about how things worked, and, most curiously, frequently accidentally, wander into Jace's quarters. Jace had no idea how or why this kept happening, but it had become a running joke between them. Every time he turned around, Arixa would be there wide-eyed, blinking up at him like she had no idea how she got there. She never meant harm, and her curiosity was, in its own way, endearing. But after the third time she wandered into his room, he had to draw the line. "Arixa," Jace said, rubbing the back of his neck as he looked down at the tall, insectoid princess who stood awkwardly by the doorway. "You've got to stop showing up in my quarters. You're not lost this time, right?" "I'm not lost." Arixa's voice was a strange mixture of frustration and amusement. Her antennae twitched erratically, a dead giveaway that she wasn't telling the full truth. She was tall, her armored exoskeleton gleaming a dark violet under the sunlight filtering in from the window, and her large compound eyes blinked at Jace in an almost innocent manner. "I was simply looking for, something to do?" Jace couldn't help but smile despite himself. "Arixa, you've been here for weeks now. You know your mother's wing is on the other side of the house. What's going on with you today?" My sister said I should get a better understanding of human, domestic life," Arixa said with an exaggerated shrug. Her antennae twitched again. "I thought I might observe your sleep patterns." Jace couldn't suppress a chuckle. "You want to see how I sleep? Well, I'll admit that's a first." Arixa's face softened, her gaze fixed on Jace with a mixture of curiosity and something else, something he couldn't quite place. She wasn't just interested in his habits. She seemed fascinated by the idea of being so close to a human. Jace, on the other hand, had long since adjusted to the Crialians' presence, though he found himself occasionally overwhelmed by their immense size and intelligence. Before Jace could respond, a sudden tremor rattled the house. A low rumble resonated from the earth below, like the heavy footsteps of something massive, something approaching at an alarming speed. "What was that?" Arixa asked, her antennae now rigid with attention. "I don't know." Jace's voice was tight with concern. The farm, tucked away in the remote hills, rarely experienced any seismic activity, But this felt different, like the ground itself was being shifted by some unseen force. Without thinking, Jace reached for the door and swung it open, his instincts as a farmer telling him something was wrong. "Stay here," he told Arixa quickly. "I'm going to check it out." But Arixa was already ahead of him, her long, swift limbs carrying her outside faster than Jace could react. "I'm coming with you," she said, voice determined. "Not this time," Jace protested, but it was no use. The alien princess had already made up her mind. They both stepped outside, where the ground continued to shake, and the sound of something massive moving through the forest reached their ears. The sky above began to darken, as though the clouds themselves had been sucked into the path of some great force. Jace's stomach twisted in unease. He had been involved in enough global crisis meetings to recognize the signs of something far worse than a random natural disaster. "What is that?" Arixa asked, her voice tense now. Her antennae were drawn back, her posture shifting from casual to alert. She wasn't just curious anymore. This was a warning. Before Jace could answer, a shadow passed over them, casting a large, jagged shape across the horizon. A massive ship, sleek and obsidian in color, hovered over the ground with an unnatural silence. It wasn't Crialian, and it wasn't human. The ship landed with a thundering crash, kicking up dirt and rocks as it settled on the edge of Jace's farm. Out of the dust emerged figures, tall, armored humanoids whose movements were precise and calculated. They stepped out of the ship like a well-trained army, their weapons drawn. Jace's heart skipped a beat as the leader, a towering figure in black armor with glowing red eyes, strode forward. "Human," the figure called in a mechanical voice. "We come to the Crialian Royal." Arixa tensed beside him. "It's me. They're after me." "No, Arixa," Jay said, his voice low and firm. "We're getting out of here. Now." But before they could retreat, the ground erupted in flashes of light, and the battle for survival began. Jace's thoughts raced, but he didn't have time to dwell on them. He had a farm to defend, a princess to protect, and no idea how the hell he was going to do either. The Crialian queen's daughters keep accidentally getting lost in humans' quarters. Jace thought with a wry grin as he grabbed Arixa by the arm and pulled her to cover. This wasn't exactly what he had signed up for, but at that moment it was too late to turn back. The war had begun. The wind howled across the farm, carrying with it a strange sense of foreboding. Jace crouched low behind the remnants of his shed, scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. The thrum of the alien ship's descent still echoed in his ears, a constant reminder that this was no mere skirmish. They were under attack, and not just by any enemies. These were highly advanced forces, clearly well-equipped and ruthless. Jace's mind raced as he kept his gaze fixed on the approaching invaders. The leader of the group, an imposing figure clad in pitch-black armor, seemed to be directing the movements of the others with military precision. Behind him, several of the soldiers were advancing in tight formation, their glowing weapons aimed forward, their steps synchronized. They were looking for something or someone, and judging by the way they were scouring the area, they weren't going to stop until they found it. Arixa stood beside Jace, her posture alert. She could feel the weight of their pursuit bearing down on them. She wasn't just a princess. She was a target. The realization had settled in moments after they saw the ship land. These invaders, whoever they were, had come for her. "We need to leave," Jace said urgently, his voice a low whisper. "We can't stay here. They'll find us if we don't move." Arixa shook her head, her antennae twitching as she narrowed her gaze on the enemy soldiers. "I won't run, Jace. Not while they're after me. If we leave now, they'll keep following. I can't risk them coming after you, too." Jace hesitated. His first instinct was to get Arixa to safety, to protect her at all costs. But he couldn't deny that she was right. These invaders weren't after a diplomatic conversation. They were here for one reason only, to capture a Crialian royal. And if she fled, they would follow her until they had what they wanted. There was no escaping it. "All right, Jay said, his voice hardening with resolve. "But if we're going to face them, we need a plan." Arixa nodded, her eyes flickering toward the trees that surrounded the farm. "We can't fight them directly, not with these numbers. We need to hit them where it hurts." Jace's mind worked quickly, thinking of the makeshift defenses he had on the farm. Nothing advanced, but perhaps enough to create a temporary advantage. "I've got a few old tools lying around. We'll use what we can." Arixa turned her attention to the approaching soldiers. "Get ready." The two of them moved quickly, ducking behind a pile of wooden crates near the edge of the field. Jace's heart pounded in his chest as he surveyed the approaching forces. He had no military experience, no combat training, but he had lived his entire life on this farm, and if there was one thing he knew, it was how to use what he had around him. "We'll have to be fast," Jace murmured, reaching down and grabbing a rusty metal pipe. He eyed Arixa, who was already in motion, her movements swift and fluid despite the bulk of her insectoid frame. "I'll take the left side. You take the right." Arixa's antennae twitched in acknowledgement, and without another word, the two of them darted into position. The sound of the enemy's soldiers' boots on the dry earth grew louder as they drew nearer, their attention focused on scouring the area for any sign of their target. Jace took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was about to come. His heart was racing, but his hands were steady. This was no longer just about survival. It was about protecting the one person who had unknowingly wormed her way into his life and changed it forever. Arixa wasn't just some alien princess to him. She was someone who trusted him, and he couldn't let her down. The first soldier appeared around the corner of the barn, scanning the area methodically. Jace waited until he was close enough, then hurled the metal pipe at his legs with all his might. It connected with a sickening thud, sending the soldier stumbling forward. Before the soldier could recover, Jace rushed forward, tackling him to the ground. The soldier's armor was tough, but Jace had caught him off guard. He grabbed the soldier's weapon, a sleek, futuristic rifle, and slammed the barrel into the soldier's chest. The soldier let out a strangled cry, and Jace didn't wait for him to recover. He grabbed the rifle, ripped it from the soldier's grasp, and swung it across his head. The soldier crumpled, unconscious. "Nice job, human." Arixa's voice came from the other side, filled with approval. Jace didn't respond. He couldn't afford to get cocky. More soldiers were approaching, and this was only the beginning. Arixa, meanwhile, had made quick work of another soldier. She used her alien strength to overpower him, slamming him into the side of the barn with a sickening crack. The soldier didn't stand a chance. She was faster, stronger, and far more agile than anything human soldiers could have prepared for. But it wasn't enough. As Jay stood up, scanning the battlefield for more targets, he realized they were surrounded. The rest of the invaders had closed in from all sides, their weapons raised, their eyes cold and calculating. "There are too many of them," Jay said, his voice tinged with frustration. Arixa's antennae twitched. "We don't need to fight all of them, just the ones in front of us." Suddenly, a loud crack split the air, and the ground beneath their feet trembled. The sky above them grew darker as a second ship descended from the clouds, its engines roaring to life as it hovered ominously above the farm. A second wave of soldiers began to pour out, this time in even greater numbers. Jace's heart sank as he looked around. There was no way they could hold out against this kind of force. They needed help, and they needed it now. "We need to call for backup," Jay said urgently. "Your mother, your fleet, they have to know what's happening." Arixa hesitated, her gaze flicking from Jace to the enemy soldiers closing in on them. "There's no time. They'll be here too late. We have to fight." The ground shook again, and Jace's stomach twisted with dread. He didn't have the luxury of second-guessing. He grabbed Arixa's arm. "Then we fight. Together." But before they could make another move, the leader of the enemy forces stepped forward. He was taller than the others, his armor gleaming darkly as he raised his weapon toward them. His voice, deep and cold, echoed across the battlefield. "Crialian Royal, Surrender now. You cannot escape. Arixa's antennae twitched in defiance, but she didn't respond. Jace, standing beside her, gripped the rifle tighter, his resolve hardening. "We'll see about that," he muttered under his breath. And then, without another word, they charged. The crackle of energy weapons cut through the air, and the earth beneath Jace's feet seemed to tremble with every shot. He didn't have time to think. His instincts kicked in as he dropped behind a nearby boulder, narrowly avoiding a blast that turned the patch of grass he'd just vacated into a smoldering crater. Arixa, moving with a grace and speed that defied her insectoid appearance, took cover beside him, her large eyes glowing with determination. "We can't keep this up forever," Jace panted, wiping sweat from his brow as he peeked over the stone barrier. "They've got the advantage in numbers and firepower." Arixa nodded, her antennae twitching with focus. "We need to turn the tide. We have the strength. They don't know what we're capable of." Jace wasn't so sure. Despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins, the odds didn't look good. The enemy's soldiers were well-coordinated and heavily armed, and now, with the second ship dropping more reinforcements, it felt like the farm was being swallowed by a storm of fire and metal. "There's got to be something we can do," Jace muttered, glancing around frantically for any advantage. Suddenly, the air around them seemed to warp with a low hum. At first, Jace thought it was just the wind, but the strange vibration deepened. Then he heard it, a familiar, comforting sound, the roar of an engine, the sound of Earth's military forces. Before he could react, a massive explosion rocked the battlefield, the blast throwing debris and dust into the air. The ground shook beneath him, and when the smoke cleared, a strange figure emerged through the haze. Jace blinked, certain his mind was playing tricks on him. Standing at the edge of the clearing was a man in a heavily worn military uniform, his face smeared with dirt and grime, but his eyes sharp and intense. His hair was wild, and slung over his shoulder was an old-fashioned rocket launcher. Jace's first instinct was to question whether he was hallucinating, but the man didn't look like a soldier from any organized military force he recognized. This wasn't some government hero coming to save the day. It was a ragged survivor, a man who had clearly been fighting for his life for a long time. "Jace!" the man shouted over the din of the battle, grinning wildly. "It's about time I caught up with you. I've been tracking those tin cans for days." Arixa looked at him, one antenna cocked in confusion. "Who is this?" "Don't know," Jay said, his mind racing. "But he's on our side, I guess." The man, who didn't seem to be bothered by the absurdity of the situation, turned to the Crialian princess. "Name's Finn. I've got a few tricks up my sleeve, so if you want to stay alive, you better listen to me." Before Jace could speak, Finn dropped to a knee and aimed his rocket launcher at one of the enemy ships hovering above them. The weapon hissed as it fired, and with a deafening roar, the missile struck the underside of the ship, sending it spiraling into a fiery explosion. The shockwave knocked Jace and Arixa off their feet, but the sight of the ship plummeting to the ground brought a surge of hope. "That's one down," Finn shouted. "How many more do we need?" Jace's heart raced as he pulled himself back to his feet. "That was incredible. But how are you even here?" "Long story, but the short version is, I've been tracking these guys for a while," Finn said with a laugh. "And from the looks of it, I'm not the only one who has a bone to pick with them. I know you've got some pretty good firepower here, Arixa. Now, let's make sure these bastards know who they're messing with." The tide had shifted, if only for a moment. Arixa looked at Finn, her antennae still twitching in bewilderment. "You're human." Finn raised an eyebrow. "Last time I checked. But I'm not exactly what you'd call normal." "What do you mean?" Jace asked, stepping forward. Finn's grin widened, revealing a set of sharp teeth. "You could say I've been running with some unsavory types. Don't worry. We're on the same team now." Jace wasn't entirely sure how this strange new ally fit into the bigger picture, but he didn't have time to question him further. With Finn here, they at least had a chance. Finn turned back toward the enemy soldiers, who had regrouped. All right, you two, get ready. We've got more work to do. He motioned to a small stash of weapons he'd brought with him, all scavenged from various sources over the years. There were rifles, grenades, and explosives. Nothing fancy, but certainly useful. We're going to need a distraction, Finn said as he tossed Jace a rifle and a few grenades. Arixa, if you're willing to get your hands dirty, I've got a plan. We're going to blow a hole in their formation, give them something to think about. Jace caught the rifle and looked over at Arixa, who had already begun to assess the battlefield. Her body shifted with unnatural precision, her exoskeleton gleaming in the light as she readied herself for whatever was coming next. I'm in, she said simply, her voice full of quiet determination. As the trio moved toward the edge of the battlefield, the sound of approaching enemies grew louder. Finn motioned for them to stay low, his eyes scanning the area as he laid out the plan. We're going to hit them hard, right in the middle of their ranks. Jace, you'll take the left flank. Arixa, you get the right. I'll provide cover from the center. We need to split their forces and create confusion. Once we've got that, we hit the command ship. You think you can take out their command? Jace asked, doubt creeping into his voice. Not alone, Finn said, winking. But with a little help from the princess? Definitely. Jace felt a surge of adrenaline. They didn't have time to think too much about the odds. They had to act. Arixa shifted next to him, her muscles coiling as she prepared for the attack. On your mark, Jace. The enemy's soldiers were now only a few hundred yards away, their formation tightening as they moved into position. Finn crouched low, readying his next shot. Jace felt the weight of his rifle in his hands. He glanced at Arixa, who nodded to him. Together, they'd take this fight to the heart of the invaders. On my count, Finn murmured, eyes locked on the enemy. 3, 2, 1. The ground erupted in gunfire as they launched their coordinated assault. Jace fired his rifle, the first shot taking down one of the soldiers in the front. Arixa followed suit, her alien strength propelling her forward as she took down another soldier with a single blow. Finn, from the center, unleashed a barrage of fire, his rocket launcher knocking out several soldiers in quick succession. For a moment, the battlefield was chaos. Explosions lit the sky, dust and debris filling the air as soldiers scattered. But the enemy wasn't done. Not yet. Their commander, the towering figure who had first spoken to them, emerged from the wreckage, unscathed and furious. We need to finish this now. Jace grunted as he ducked behind cover, his heart hammering in his chest. Arixa stepped forward, her eyes glowing with a fierce determination. Let's do it. The dust hung heavy in the air as the battlefield crackled with the remnants of explosions, and the distant wail of sirens echoed faintly in the distance. The once peaceful farm had become a war zone, a surreal juxtaposition of fire, metal, and the blood-red glow of the setting sun. The invaders were regrouping, their command ship still hovering ominously above them, its sleek black form casting a long shadow over the field. But Jace, Arixa, and Finn weren't done yet. The explosion of the command ship earlier had disrupted the invaders' formation, but they weren't retreating. They were reorganizing, preparing for a final push to capture their target. Arixa, Jace crouched behind a pile of rubble, peering out toward the distant cluster of enemy soldiers. He could see their leader, the armored giant, barking orders to his troops, but for the first time, he could see fear in the commander's eyes. Their forces were no longer coordinated, and their confidence had been shaken. Arixa's power, Finn's unpredictability, and Jace's sheer determination had thrown them off balance. Arixa stood to his side, her massive form still eerily calm, but Jace could sense the tension in her. The invaders were coming for her. She had known it from the moment they landed, but now that they were closing in on her, it felt different. Personal. She glanced at Jace, her sharp eyes locking onto his. We don't have much time. They'll try to overwhelm us with force. Jace looked over at Finn, who was already setting up explosives near the enemy's ranks. The man was a walking chaos machine, and he was more than capable of causing havoc where it mattered most. But even with Finn's help, Jace knew that this wasn't something they could win by just pushing back with brute force. A final move was needed, and that was where Arixa's true power lay. "Are you ready?" Jace asked quietly, his voice steady, though his nerves were coiled tight. Arixa nodded, her antennae twitching with an intensity that mirrored her resolve. "I will not run. I will not hide. This is my home now, too." Jace clenched his jaw, understanding the weight of her words. She had become part of his world, whether by accident or fate. And now, more than ever, he knew that protecting her wasn't just about survival. It was about standing up for what was right. Earth wasn't just a place of refuge for the Crialians. It was a future they'd forged together, a shared destiny. As if on cue, the ground shook again, but this time, the source was unmistakable. The enemy forces had begun their final push. Hundreds of soldiers moved as one, marching in synchronized waves, their weapons raised, their eyes cold with purpose. The commander, still alive despite the chaos, stood at the forefront, his glowing red eyes scanning the horizon. "Princess Arixa," the commander shouted, his voice amplified by a metallic distortion. "You cannot escape. Surrender now, and your people may yet be spared." Arixa's eyes narrowed, her expression cold and resolute. "I will not bow to threats, invader." Jace's heart pounded as he reached for his rifle, ready to face whatever came next. But Finn, always the wild card, cut him off, raising a hand. "Not yet," Finn said with a grin that was almost manic. "We're going to turn the tide now, not later. Arixa, trust me, you need to give them a show." Arixa tilted her head slightly, her antennae quivering. "A show." Before she could protest, Finn reached into his pack and pulled out a small device, something Jace didn't immediately recognize. He handed it to Arixa, who studied it carefully, her mandibles clicking in confusion. "Use it when the time comes," Finn instructed. "It'll amplify your natural abilities, give you the power to really make them listen." Jace exchanged a quick look with Arixa. He knew Finn wasn't the type to rely on too many high-tech gadgets, so this must have been something valuable. Arixa nodded, though she looked uneasy about using something that wasn't familiar to her. "I trust you," she said, securing the device in her belt. The moment the invaders crossed the perimeter, Jace gave a silent nod. "Now." Finn's signal was immediate. With a violent roar, he pressed a button on his own device, setting off a chain reaction of explosions that tore through the enemy ranks. The blast shook the air, sending soldiers sprawling as debris rained down on them. The sudden chaos threw them into disarray, their formations collapsing in confusion. As the explosions rocked the battlefield, Arixa moved. In an instant, she was a blur of motion, her massive form darting between the enemy soldiers with frightening speed. Her movements were a dance of destruction. She slashed through their ranks with her claws, each strike knocking soldiers aside as though they were nothing more than rag dolls. The soldiers, stunned by her ferocity, fired wildly in all directions, but their weapons seemed inadequate against her. "Fall back," the commander ordered, but it was too late. Arixa was unstoppable. Her speed and strength, enhanced by the device Finn had given her, made her an unstoppable force on the battlefield. She moved like lightning, her exoskeleton glowing with a faint, otherworldly energy as she tore through the enemy's front lines. Jace, too, was in motion. He fired his rifle with precision, each shot taking down one of the invaders, his hand steady despite the chaos. But he couldn't keep up with Arixa. She was everywhere, a blur of lethal efficiency, carving a path through the invaders with ease. But even as their forces crumbled before Arixa's wrath, the commander stood firm, his massive form looming over the battlefield. He was not one to retreat, not one to accept defeat. "You think this is over?" he growled, his voice amplified by some kind of speaker embedded in his helmet. "You will regret this, Crialian." Arixa stopped in her tracks, her glowing eyes locking onto the commander's. She did respond with words. She responded with action. With a mighty roar, Arixa charged forward, her body moving faster than Jace had ever seen. Her claws gleamed with deadly intent as she leaped into the air, slamming into the commander's chest with the force of a freight train. The soldier stumbled backward, and for a moment, the ground seemed to pause. Then, with one final, brutal motion, Arixa twisted, ripping through the commander's armor and sending him crashing to the ground. For a brief moment, there was silence. The remaining invaders hesitated. Their leader had fallen, and their ranks were in disarray. The battlefield had shifted irrevocably. The Crialians had won. Arixa stood over the fallen commander, her chest heaving with exertion. She looked down at him, her gaze cold, but there was no satisfaction in her eyes. Just a quiet weight of victory. "It's done," Arixa said, turning to Jace, her voice steady. "They're broken." Jace nodded, stepping forward. "We've got to finish this. They'll regroup if we don't act fast." Arixa didn't argue. She knew the battle wasn't truly over until the last invader had been driven off the field. With Finn's help, they had turned the tide, but it would take more than just a single victory to secure their future. As they prepared for the final push, Jace realized that no matter how it ended, his life had changed forever. He had fought beside a Crialian princess, survived an alien invasion, and forged a bond that would shape the future of both worlds. And as the last of the invaders retreated into the sky, he understood one thing. This was only the beginning.